I did not come 2,000 miles to be managed, Mr. Calloway. I came to save what you're too proud to admit is already dying. 30 seconds off the train. No smile, no apology. Just those dark, steady eyes locked onto his, like she'd already taken his measure and found him wanting. Wyatt Calloway had sent for a quiet wife, someone grateful, someone manageable. What stepped off that platform in the summer of 1888 was something else entirely. One suitcase, a leather notebook, and a mind sharper than anyone in Red Mesa Valley was prepared for, including him. Especially him. If this story already has you hooked, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into part 1. Wyatt Calloway had made exactly 3 decisions in his life that he'd later admit were made out of desperation. The first was buying land in Red Mesa Valley when everyone said the soil was too dry to sustain a herd. The second was borrowing against that land during a hard winter to keep his cattle alive when half his neighbors were selling off at a loss. The third was answering an advertisement in the Dallas Morning Gazette for a mail-order marriage service. He'd stared at that advertisement for 4 days before writing the letter. He'd torn up the first draft, and the second. The third one he'd sent before he could change his mind again, because at 36 years old, Wyatt Calloway had come to understand something he'd spent most of his adult life refusing to face. He was lonely. Bone-deep aching lonely. The kind of lonely that a full barn and a healthy herd and 3,000 acres couldn't touch. He didn't tell anyone he'd sent the letter. Not his ranch foreman Dale Pruitt. Not his neighbor and oldest friend Hank Briggs. Not a single soul in Red Mesa. He just waited. And 6 weeks later, a reply came back from a woman named Evelyn Brooks of Boston, Massachusetts. Her letter was unlike anything he'd expected. It was 3 pages long, written in a tight, precise hand, and it contained exactly 0 flowery language, 0 romantic sentiment, and 0 mention of loneliness or heartbreak, or the desperate hope for a better life. Instead, Evelyn Brooks had written him a clear-eyed assessment of what she could offer, what she expected in return, and what she believed made a household function with dignity and purpose. She'd managed a large estate in Boston for 7 years. She understood supply chains, labor management, budget reconciliation, and seasonal resource planning. She was 31 in good health, had no family obligations tying her to the East, and was prepared to relocate permanently, provided the arrangement was entered into honestly by both parties. Wyatt read the letter 3 times. Then he sat back in his chair and said out loud to nobody, "What in the hell is this woman?" He wrote back. She replied. They exchanged 4 more letters over the following month, each one growing slightly less formal, slightly more candid. Wyatt found himself looking forward to her letters in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. They didn't talk about feelings. They talked about cattle pricing, drought patterns, land management, and the particular challenges of running a large operation short-staffed. And somehow, in the middle of all that practical talk, he'd agreed to marry her. She would arrive on the 3rd Tuesday of June. He told himself he was doing a smart thing, a practical thing. He needed someone to manage the household. He was too busy running 20 miles of fence line and tracking a herd of over 400 cattle to deal with domestic logistics. This was a business arrangement dressed in wedding clothes. That was all. He almost believed it. The morning Evelyn's train was due. Wyatt put on his good shirt, brushed the dust off his hat, and drove the wagon into Red Mesa alone. He did not ask Dale to come with him. He did not stop at the general store to tell anyone where he was going. He pulled up to the depot with 12 minutes to spare, tied off the horse, and stood on the platform with his arms crossed and his jaw set, like a man preparing for something he wasn't entirely sure he could handle. The train was on time, which he respected. The passengers came off in the usual stream, a traveling salesman with an oversized case, a family with 3 children who were already running in 3 directions, a minister in a black coat, 2 cowboys who looked like they'd been riding all night. And then she stepped off. Wyatt had a vague, embarrassing idea of what he'd been picturing. Something soft. Something a little weary around the edges. A woman who would look at Red Mesa and see salvation rather than assignment. A woman who would be grateful. Evelyn Brooks stepped off that train carrying one suitcase and wearing a practical dark blue dress with no ornamentation whatsoever, and the first thing she did was look up at the sun. Not at him, not at the town, at the sun. Like she was calculating the time and the heat and the angle of light and running it all through some private equation in her head. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were brown, dark brown, the kind that didn't give away what they were thinking. She walked directly to him, set down the suitcase, and extended her hand like she was meeting a business associate. "Mr. Calloway." He shook it, automatically. "Miss Brooks." "You're taller than I expected." She said it matter-of-factly, no flattery attached. "You're, He stopped. He'd been about to say something stupid. "You travel light," he managed. "I brought what I need." She glanced toward the wagon. "Is that yours?" "It is." "Good. I'd like to ride through the ranch before we reach the house if you don't mind. I want to see the layout before we settle anything." Wyatt blinked. "Before we settle anything." "Before we make any agreements about routine and responsibility. I want to understand what I'm looking at." She picked up her suitcase. "Shall we?" He stood there for one full second, genuinely uncertain whether to be impressed or insulted. He picked up her suitcase for her. She let him. That was something at least. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, climbed up himself, and as he released the brake and clicked the horse forward, Evelyn pulled a small leather notebook from her coat pocket and opened it on her knee. Wyatt glanced sideways at the notebook. "What's that for?" "Notes," she said. "Notes. I find it useful to record first impressions of a new operation. The patterns you notice immediately are often the ones that matter most." She looked at the road ahead. You can tell a great deal about how a ranch is managed by what you see in the first 20 minutes. Wyatt said nothing to that. Mostly because he had an uneasy feeling she was already seeing things. He wasn't wrong. She started with the water. They hadn't even reached the main gate when she said, "Your water source, is it spring-fed or creek-fed?" "Creek," he said. "Comes off the Blackthorn tributary, runs about a mile east of the main barn." "One source. There's a well near the bunkhouse." "Depth. 40-45 feet." She wrote something down. He watched her from the corner of his eye. "Is there a reason you're asking about water before you've asked about the house?" he said. "The house won't die in a drought," she said simply. "A single water source might." Wyatt felt something shift slightly in his chest. He couldn't name it. Irritation, maybe, or the beginning of respect. He wasn't sure yet. They rode on. She pointed at the eastern fence line. "That section is lower than the rest." "Storm damage. I've got it on the list." "Move it up," she said. "If cattle push against it during a run, you'll lose them through that gap." Wyatt gripped the reins a little tighter. "Miss Brooks, I've been running this ranch for 11 years. She looked at him calmly. "I know. And it's a good ranch. But good isn't the same as protected." She turned back to the fence. "How often do you lose cattle to fence breaks?" He didn't answer immediately. "Twice last year," he finally said. She wrote it down. He had a feeling she was going to write a lot of things down. They arrived at the main house mid-afternoon, and for the first time something shifted in Evelyn's expression. Not sentiment exactly, but something quieter. She looked at the house for a long moment before climbing down from the wagon. "It's solid," she said. "Built it myself," he said. "Took 3 years." She looked at him. Something passed across her face too quickly to read. "You built it yourself." "Had help, but yes." She nodded once. Then she walked toward the front door. Wyatt followed with her suitcase, and he had the peculiar sensation of being a guest in his own home. Inside, she moved through every room without being invited. Opening doors, checking windows, running a hand along the kitchen shelves, crouching to look at the floor near the back door, where water had warped the wood. "You've had flooding in here," she said. "Once, 2 years ago. I fixed the drainage outside." The fix held, Mostly. I'll want to look at the drainage this week. Wyatt set down the suitcase in the hallway and turned to face her. She was standing in the middle of the kitchen with her notebook open and her pen moving, and something in him finally ran out of patience. "Miss Brooks," he said. She looked up. "We're supposed to be getting married in 2 days," he said. "I just thought I don't know you might have something to say about that." She held his gaze, steady, no flinch. "I have quite a bit to say about that," she said, "but I find practical conversation easier before personal ones. It helps me understand who I'm actually dealing with." She paused. "I don't think you're looking for a wife so much as a solution to a management problem." The words hit him square. He opened his mouth, closed it. "I'm not offended by that," she continued. "I'm in a similar position. I'm not looking for romance. I'm looking for a partnership that functions." She closed the notebook. "But here is what I will tell you, Mr. Calloway. I do not do things halfway. If I commit to this ranch, I will commit fully. And I will expect the same from you, not just in how you run the operation, but in how you treat me within it." Silence. "Fair enough," Wyatt said, because he didn't have a single other word available to him. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning at the small church on the edge of town, with the Reverend Hooper officiating, and exactly 4 witnesses, Dale Pruitt, Hank Briggs, and 2 women from the church auxiliary, who had shown up for reasons Wyatt suspected had more to do with curiosity than piety. Everyone in Red Mesa had heard that Wyatt Calloway had sent for an Eastern wife. The entire town was watching with great interest. Evelyn wore the same dark blue dress. She didn't carry flowers. She recited the vows in a clear, even voice, without faltering once. When Wyatt slid the ring onto her finger, she looked down at it for a moment, and he thought he saw something move behind those dark eyes. Something real, something unguarded. It was there, and then it was gone. "I do," she said. "I do," he said. Hank Briggs shook Wyatt's hand afterward and leaned in close. "She's not what I expected," he said quietly. "No," Wyatt said, "she is absolutely not." At the reception, a modest meal at Hank's house that Wyatt had not planned, but that the church women had apparently organized on their own, Evelyn sat at the table and answered every question directed at her with precision warmth when it was warranted, and a dry, quiet humor that caught people off guard. By the time the meal was finished, Hank's wife Martha was asking Evelyn questions about estate management in Boston, and Evelyn was answering in a way that made the whole table lean slightly forward. Wyatt watched from across the room. He had a feeling strange, uncomfortable, and very new that he had brought home someone he did not yet understand, and that understanding her was going to be the most important work he'd ever done. That first night back at the ranch, Wyatt sat at the kitchen table with a whiskey he wasn't really drinking and tried to organize his thoughts into something sensible. He heard Evelyn moving through the house behind him. Quiet footsteps, a drawer opening, something being shifted in the pantry. He assumed she was settling in. He was wrong. An hour after dark, he heard the front door open. He turned. Evelyn was standing in the doorway in her coat, holding a lantern in one hand and that notebook in the other. "You're going out," he said. "I want to walk the perimeter of the barn structures while it's quiet. You can see the layout better at night, no shadows from the sun to distort the angles." Wyatt set down his glass. "It's 9 o'clock. I know what time it is. We just got married today." She looked at him. Something in her expression softened slightly just for a moment. "Mr. Calloway Wyatt, I'm not going far. I'll be back within the hour, but I need to understand this place if I'm going to help you protect it." She paused. "And I intend to help you protect it." He didn't stop her. He sat at that table and listened to the creak of the porch steps and the soft sound of her boots crossing the yard. And he did something he hadn't done in years. He got up and followed her. Not immediately. He waited 5 minutes. Then he got his own coat, lit his own lantern, and walked out into the dark. He found her standing near the old barn's eastern wall, running her hand along the wood, pressing gently in places, like she was listening for something. "Soft here," she said without turning around. She knew he was there. She'd heard him coming. Of course she had. And here. The wood's been compromised. How old is this structure? 20 years, he said, coming to stand beside her. It needs reinforcement on this wall before next winter. She wrote it down. The roof, too, I can see from where the nails have rusted along the upper edge. They stood side by side in the dark lamplight, making shadows jump along the barn wall. You really did come here to work, Wyatt said. I told you I did. I thought that was, I don't know, a way of presenting yourself well. She turned to look at him. In the lamplight, her face was different than it was in daylight. Less guarded, more real. I don't present myself, she said. I am who I appear to be. I've never had the patience for anything else. He believed her, which was, he realized, the most dangerous thing of all. Because standing there in the dark beside this woman he'd been married to for 10 hours, watching her map his ranch by lantern light on what should have been the quietest night of the year. Wyatt Calloway understood something he hadn't planned to understand at all. This was not going to be a practical arrangement. This was not going to be a managed distance, a polite coexistence, a tidy division of responsibilities. Whatever this woman was, whatever she carried in that one suitcase and that leather notebook, and those dark, honest eyes, it was going to change him. He just didn't know yet whether he was ready for that. He fell into step beside her as she moved toward the well near the bunkhouse, and without planning to, without any kind of decision being made, he started answering her questions about the ranch, the way he'd never talked about it with anyone. Not just the facts, the feelings, the years of work, the failures he'd quietly buried, the things he was afraid of losing. She listened, wrote nothing down, just listened. And Wyatt Calloway, who had spent 11 years building walls as solid as that old barn, felt the first one come slightly loose. Later, walking back to the house, she stopped and looked up at the sky. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Cloud patterns," she said. "The way the clouds are stacking from the southwest this time of year, it matters." He looked up. "You think we're heading for a dry summer?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think you should hope I'm wrong," she said. "But I've been watching the rainfall records you showed me in your letters, and I think this valley is going to be tested before winter." He felt it then, not fear exactly, but something close. The instinct that had kept him alive for 11 years on hard land told him she was right. "Then we'd better be ready," he said. She looked at him, and something in her expression settled, like she'd been waiting to see whether he'd argue with her or hear her. "Yes," she said quietly. "We'd better." They walked back to the house together, lanterns swinging in step, and neither of them said another word. But neither of them walked ahead of the other either, exactly side by side. And that said everything neither of them was ready to say out loud. The morning after the wedding, Wyatt woke up before sunrise, the way he always did. Old habit bone deep, and found the kitchen already warm. Evelyn was at the stove, not fumbling with it, not figuring it out, working it like she'd cooked on that particular stove her entire life. Coffee already made, bacon already going, a small pot of something that smelled like oats, and brown sugar sitting low on the back burner. Wyatt stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her. She didn't turn around. "Sit down," she said. "It'll be ready in 4 minutes." He sat. "You found everything." "I inventoried the pantry last night after we came in." She moved the bacon without looking at it. "You're low on salt, almost out of baking powder, and whoever bought your last sack of flour bought the wrong grade for bread. It's milling flour, fine for gravy, not much else." Wyatt put both hands around the coffee mug she set in front of him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. She sat across from him with her own coffee and her notebook already open beside her plate, and while they ate, she talked clearly, directly, without any of the careful softness that people usually brought to first morning conversations. She had 3 things she wanted to address in the first week: the barn wall reinforcement, the water situation, and the feed schedule she'd seen posted inside the main barn door, which she'd read 3 times last night and was convinced could be restructured to cut waste by at least 15%. 15%. Wyatt repeated. Minimum. Possibly closer to 20 if the herd separation I'm thinking of actually works the way I believe it will. She looked up from her notebook. I want to talk to Dale about it this morning. Dale's been managing that feed schedule for 6 years. I know. I'd like to understand his reasoning before I suggest anything. I'm not interested in embarrassing anyone. She said it plainly. No politics in it. Just fact. But if there's a better way, I'd rather find it fast. Waste has a compounding cost. Wyatt looked at her across the table. The early light was coming through the window behind her, and she was reading her own notes, with the kind of focused attention that most people reserved for things they were passionate about. Not performing diligence, actually feeling it. You enjoy this, he said. It came out more surprised than he intended. She glanced up. Solving problems? Yes. A pause. Is that strange to you? Most people don't enjoy it. They endure it. Something shifted in her expression. Almost a smile, but stopped just short. Then most people are working on the wrong problems, she said, and went back to her notes. Dale Pruitt was a compact, weathered man of 52 who had worked for Wyatt for 8 years and ran the daily operation with the kind of quiet competence that Wyatt had come to depend on absolutely. He was not a man who warmed to strangers quickly. He was not a man who responded well to being told his system needed improvement. He also was, as it turned out, completely unprepared for Evelyn Brooks Calloway. Wyatt brought her out to the barn at 7:30, made the introduction brief, and then deliberately stepped back to let whatever was going to happen. Evelyn shook Dale's hand and said, Mr. Pruitt, I've read the feed schedule posted on your barn door. I have some questions if you have a few minutes. Dale looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at the middle distance. Sure, Dale said with the careful tone of a man who wasn't sure at all. What followed was 40 minutes that Wyatt would later describe to Hank Briggs as one of the most remarkable conversations he'd ever witnessed on his own property. Evelyn didn't lecture. She asked. She asked Dale why he'd structured the morning rotation the way he had, and when he explained, she asked follow-up questions that were precise enough that Dale found himself explaining not just what he did, but why it had evolved that way, and where he'd always privately suspected it wasn't working as well as it should. By the end of it, Dale was the one suggesting changes. Not Evelyn. Dale. And when they walked out of the barn, Dale fell into step beside Evelyn rather than behind her, and they were talking about the eastern pasture rotation, like they'd been working together for years. Wyatt followed 2 steps behind them, feeling something he couldn't immediately categorize. He figured out later what it was. Pride. The first week became the second became the third. Evelyn moved through the ranch like she was solving a puzzle that no one had been able to see in its entirety before because no one had been willing to look at all of it at once. She talked to every worker individually, not to inspect them, but to understand what they knew. She reorganized the storage barn, not by what was convenient, but by what was needed, most often and fastest. She pulled out Wyatt's expense ledgers from the past 3 years and went through them at the kitchen table, over 2 evenings, making notes in that narrow, precise handwriting. And then she presented Wyatt with a single page of findings that made him set down his coffee and stare at it for a long time. You've been losing money on the eastern pasture rotation, she said. Not because you're doing it wrong, because the grass recovery time you're allowing isn't calibrated to the actual rainfall this section of valley receives. You're overgrazing by about 2 weeks each cycle. Over a year that compounds into significant degradation. She pointed to the numbers. Here and here. No one told me that. No one measured it, she said. I pulled the rainfall records from the county office in town, compared them against your cattle count per acre. The math is right. Wyatt looked at the numbers, then at her. How long did this take you? 2 evenings. Evelyn. She looked up. This would have taken me a year to figure out on my own, if I ever did. Something moved across her face, quick and honest. You would have figured it out, she said. You're not a man who misses things forever. You miss them when you're too busy doing everything yourself to step back far enough to see the whole picture. It was a more generous thing to say than he deserved, and something in the way she said it quietly, without any performance of kindness, made the words land somewhere deeper than he expected. He looked back at the numbers. "All right," he said, "show me what you're thinking." And she did. For 2 hours at that kitchen table, with the lamp burning between them, she walked him through everything she'd found and everything she proposed. And he asked questions and pushed back where he had ground to push back on, and she adjusted and explained and held firm where the data supported her. And by the time they were done, they had a plan that was genuinely better than anything either of them would have produced alone. Wyatt sat back and looked at what they'd built on that table, pages of notes, numbers, revised, schedules. And he felt something strange and warming in his chest. This was what it was supposed to feel like. Having someone. Not just present in the house, but actually there. Thinking alongside him. He hadn't known he was missing it until he had it. The town of Red Mesa had opinions about all of this, naturally. The opinions arrived at Wyatt's awareness through Hank Briggs, who absorbed local conversation the way sandstone absorbs water, and who couldn't resist being the delivery mechanism for all of it. Charlie Ames says your wife told his wife that the Johnson Creek irrigation system is 20 years out of date. Hank reported one morning leaning against the fence while Wyatt checked a post. "She's right," Wyatt said. "Martha thinks she's remarkable. Martha also thinks she's frightening. She can be both. Jake Teller at the feed store says she came in and asked him to price flour by grade and he had to go get a catalog because he didn't know what grade meant." Wyatt almost smiled. "What did she end up buying?" "The right grade, presumably." Hank paused. "Wyatt, how is it actually going?" Wyatt straightened up. He thought about the question seriously the way Hank deserved. "It's going," he said. "Better than I expected. Different than I expected." "Different how?" She doesn't need managing. She doesn't need direction. She shows up already knowing what needs to happen, and she just does it." He paused. "It's unsettling, Hank. In a good way. Mostly." Hank looked at him. "You like her." "I respect her." I said what I said. Wyatt picked up his tools and moved to the next post, but he didn't argue. What Wyatt didn't tell Hank, what he hadn't told anyone because he barely admitted it to himself, was that the evenings had become the part of the day he noticed most, not looked forward to. Noticed. There was a difference, and he was very careful about it. But somewhere in the 3rd week of their marriage, a pattern had settled into the household that neither of them had agreed to, and neither of them had broken. After supper, if there wasn't immediate work to address, they sat in the main room, Evelyn with her notebook or a book she'd brought from Boston. Wyatt with whatever account ledger or fence report needed attention, and they were quiet together in a way that was not uncomfortable. That was the thing he couldn't explain. The quiet wasn't awkward. It wasn't the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who didn't feel the need to fill the air to prove they were comfortable. He'd never had that with anyone. One evening she looked up from her book and said without preamble, "What made you choose this valley?" He considered making a short answer. He didn't. "Everyone told me it was too dry," he said. "I figured if everyone was scared of it, the land would be cheap and I could prove them wrong." "Did you? 11 years later, I'm still here." "That's not the same as proving them wrong." "No," he said, "but I'm working on it." She held his gaze for a moment. "You chose it because you needed something that only worked if you were exceptional," she said quietly. "Average effort would have failed here. You needed a place that demanded everything." He had no idea what to do with that, with being seen that clearly by someone who'd known him less than a month. So he said, "Why Boston? Why leave?" She looked back at her book. A pause. "Because the estate I managed was sold. And when it was sold, the family that sold it didn't think of me as someone who needed a reference or a severance. They thought of me as furniture, something included in the transaction or left at the door. She said it evenly. No bitterness she was willing to display. I had been there 7 years. 7 years of making their home function, making their finances work, keeping their staff from quitting. And when it was over, I was simply gone. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. That's why you came west. I came west because I wanted to be somewhere that my work had my name on it, not someone else's. She finally looked up. This ranch, if we make it work, it carries both our names. That matters to me. He felt the word settle somewhere permanent. Evelyn. Yes. This ranch already carries your name. As far as I'm concerned, it has since the first morning. She looked at him. Really looked. And then she nodded once slowly and went back to her book. But there was something different in her face. Something quieter. Something that looked like it might be very carefully and very privately relief. It was in the 4th week that the first real sign arrived. Not an argument. Not a crisis. Something quieter and more ominous than either. Dale came to the house on a Saturday morning and knocked instead of just walking to the barn where Wyatt usually was at that hour. When Wyatt opened the door, Dale's face told him something was wrong before a word was spoken. "Creek's down," Dale said. Wyatt felt it immediately. That specific pull in the stomach that a rancher feels when he hears water news in summer. How far down? A third. Maybe more. Since Tuesday. Evelyn appeared in the hallway behind Wyatt. "How much rain did we get in May?" she asked. "Not enough," Dale said. He looked at her. "Ma'am, I've been watching this creek for 8 years. It drops in August, sometimes in July. Not in June." "No," Evelyn said. She was very still. "Not in June." Wyatt looked at her. She already had her notebook. He didn't know when she'd picked it up. "The rainfall records," she said, mostly to herself. "The pattern I noticed in the county data." She looked up at both of them. "I need to check something. Can you take me to the creek?" They went. Standing at the bank, Wyatt could see it immediately. The waterline markers worn into the rock showed clearly how far the level had dropped. Dale was right. A third, maybe more. And not from usage. From source. Evelyn crouched at the bank and looked upstream. "The Blackthorn tributary," she said. "How far back does it run before it reaches your property line?" 6-7 miles, Wyatt said. "And above that? Highlands, rocky ground, thin grass." She stood up. "If the snowpack was low this winter, which the county records suggest it was further north, the tributary won't recover naturally until fall at the earliest." She turned to face him. "Wyatt, this isn't a summer dip. I think this is the beginning of a significant drought." The word hung in the air. Dale said nothing. He was looking at the creek with the expression of a man who'd been afraid of exactly this for weeks and hadn't let himself say it. "How significant?" Wyatt said. Evelyn didn't soften it. "Potentially the worst this valley has seen in a generation," she said, "if I'm reading the patterns correctly." And there it was. The thing he'd been feeling at the edge of his awareness since early spring, the thing he hadn't named, because naming it made it real. Here it was named. By the woman he'd brought home 3 weeks ago, standing at the bank of his shrinking creek, holding her notebook with both hands. "What do we do?" he asked. It was the first time he'd asked her that. Not consulted her, not listened while she suggested, asked directly immediately like it was the most natural thing. She noticed. He saw her notice. "First," she said, "we find out how much water we actually have access to, not just the creek, everything." She looked at Dale. "Mr. Pruitt, is there anyone in this valley who knows the old land well, before the current ranches were built? Someone who knows what's underneath?" Dale scratched the back of his neck. "Old Amos Shelby might. He was here before anyone. 80 years old, barely leaves his place, but he remembers everything. Can we talk to him? I can ask." "Today," Evelyn said. Dale looked at Wyatt. Wyatt nodded. Dale went. Evelyn stood at the creek bank for another moment, looking at the water. Wyatt stood beside her, and the fear that had been building in his chest all spring was still there. But it was different now. It wasn't the solitary, directionless fear of a man facing a disaster alone. It was the sharpened, purposeful fear of someone who had a partner beside them and a plan beginning to form. "How bad?" he said again quietly. Just the two of them now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Bad enough that we need to start preparing today. Not next week, today." "Then that's what we do," he said. She turned to look at him. In the morning light, her expression was serious and clear and utterly unafraid, and he thought that whatever fear was left in him pulled back slightly, just from being in the presence of that steadiness. "Victor Hale's been making offers around the valley," she said. "3 ranches in the last 2 months. Have you been watching that?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. "I've been watching. If the drought is what I think it is, he's not making those offers by chance." Her eyes were steady and direct. "Someone has been feeding him information about the water situation. He knows what's coming." Wyatt hadn't made that connection. He felt it lock into place now with a cold, clean click. He's positioning, she confirmed, "which means we don't have just a drought to survive. We have a man waiting for us to be desperate enough to sell at whatever price he names." The creek ran thin and quiet beside them. "Then we don't get desperate," Wyatt said. "No," Evelyn said. "We don't." She opened her notebook to a clean page. And the work, the real work, the survival kind, the kind that would define everything began. Old Amos Shelby lived 4 miles east of the Calloway property in a house that had been standing since before Red Mesa had a name. Dale brought him out the following morning, a slow, deliberate man who moved like every step was a decision he'd already made twice, and Evelyn met him at the gate and shook his hand with both of hers and said, "Mr. Shelby, I'm told you know this land better than anyone living. I'd be grateful for an hour of your time." Amos looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Wyatt. "Smart woman," he said. "She is," Wyatt said. "All right," Amos said. 1 hour. It became 3. Amos talked, and Evelyn listened and wrote. And what emerged from that conversation was something that changed the shape of everything Wyatt thought he knew about his own property. Amos described the valley as it had been in 1849 when his father had first settled it. The creek patterns, the springs, the underground water movements that the old-timers had tracked by instinct, and that no formal survey had ever recorded. He talked about a drought in 1857 that had killed half the cattle in the region and driven 2/3 of the early settlers out. He talked about how the families that survived had done it not by luck, but by finding water that wasn't visible on the surface. And then he said something that made Evelyn go very still. "There was a cistern," Amos said. "Old German family built it late 40s, under their barn. They collected rainwater, stored it underground, kept it cool. When the 57 drought hit, they had water when nobody else did. Family sold the property in 1861 that became your land, son." He looked at Wyatt. "Don't know what happened to the cistern. Nobody ever talked about it after." Evelyn looked up from her notebook. "Where was the barn?" Amos pointed. "Northeast, toward the old structure at the far edge of the Calloway property, the one Wyatt had always used for overflow storage, and occasionally thought about tearing down because it was barely standing." Evelyn looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at the northeast corner of his property. "That barn's been there since I bought the land," he said slowly. "I assumed it was just old. Nobody told me anything about—" "Go look," Amos said simply. They went that afternoon, Wyatt, Evelyn, and Dale with 2 ranch hands carrying lanterns and shovels. The old barn floor was packed earth layered with decades of hay dust and old debris. They moved everything, all of it. 2 hours of clearing before Dale's shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. Wood. Thick treated wood. A cover. Wyatt pulled it up himself. Beneath it was a cistern 12 feet across, stone-lined, dry now, but structurally intact, deep enough that 3 men standing on each other's shoulders wouldn't have reached the bottom. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Dale said very quietly, "Lord Almighty." Evelyn was already on her knees at the edge, running her hands along the stone lining, checking the mortar, testing the integrity of the walls. "It's sound," she said. "The lining is cracked in 2 places, but repairable. The depth," she dropped a pebble and counted the seconds before it hit bottom. "It can hold enough water to sustain the herd through a 2-month dry period. Maybe longer if we're careful." Wyatt stood at the edge of that cistern and felt something shift in him. Not just hope, but something bigger than hope. The sense that the land he'd fought for 11 years had been holding something in reserve for him, waiting for someone to look. "Can we repair it in time?" he asked. Evelyn looked up at him. "That depends on how fast we move," she said. "And how fast this drought is actually moving." She stood up. "We need to start tomorrow." They started tomorrow. What followed was the most relentless 2 weeks of work Wyatt had ever supervised, and he'd built 300 feet of stone fence in a single August with 4 men and a mule. Evelyn organized the repair effort with the same systematic precision she'd brought to the feed schedule and the storage barn. But faster now, harder, with an urgency that infected everyone around her. She sourced the right mortar from the county seat 40 miles away, talked the supply man into delivering in 3 days instead of 7 by explaining exactly what they were racing against, and had 2 of the ranch hands in the cistern reinforcing cracks before the materials were even fully unloaded from the wagon. Wyatt worked beside his men every day. Physical work had always been his answer to anxiety, and there was plenty of anxiety to answer for. The creek dropped another 6 inches in the second week of July. 2 neighboring ranches, the Harmon place to the south and old Pete Garfield's operation to the west, announced they were selling off cattle at reduced prices because they couldn't sustain the feed cost through a dry summer. Wyatt bought what he could manage to absorb. It wasn't charity. It was the right thing and the practical thing simultaneously, and those were increasingly the same thing when Evelyn was thinking alongside him. Victor Hale arrived on a Wednesday. Wyatt was at the northeast barn when Dale came to get him. "Man at the front gate," Dale said. "Hale, 2 riders with him." Wyatt handed his tools to the nearest hand and walked to the front gate without hurrying, because hurrying would tell Hale something, and Wyatt had no intention of telling Victor Hale anything. Hale was a large man, well-dressed with the kind of easy confidence that came from having won so many negotiations that the possibility of losing had stopped feeling real. He had silver hair and cold blue eyes, and a smile that was technically a smile the way a fence post was technically a resting place. "Calloway," he said pleasantly. "Good to see you." "Hale." Wyatt stopped at the gate, did not open it. "What brings you out?" "Same thing that's bringing everyone to a conversation these days." Hale looked out across the property with the practiced appreciation of a man calculating rather than admiring. "Difficult summer coming. I imagine you've been watching the creek like everyone else." "I watch my creek, yes." "Smart man." Hale produced a folded paper from his coat. "I want to make this simple because I respect you. I always have. So I'm coming to you first before things get difficult with an honest number." He held out the paper. Wyatt didn't take it. "I'm not selling." A beat. Hale's smile didn't change. "You haven't seen the number." "Doesn't matter what the number is." "Now Calloway, be reasonable. The Harmon place went under last week. Garfield's barely holding on. You've got 1 water source for 400 head a dry summer stretching to November if the pattern holds. And I have what I need," Wyatt said. Hale studied him. Something shifted in those blue eyes, a small recalibration. "You found water," he said. He said it like a statement, not a question. And Wyatt understood immediately, with a cold certainty, that Hale had sources. Someone in or near Red Mesa was feeding this man information, and that information was good enough that Hale could read a man's confidence and know what it meant. "You can leave the offer at the gate if you want," Wyatt said. "But my answer's the same today as it'll be in November." Hale held the paper for another moment. Then he tucked it back into his coat. "My offer has an expiration," he said pleasantly. "When things get worse, and they will Calloway, that's not a threat, that's whether the number goes down." Understood, Wyatt said. Hale tipped his hat and rode out. Wyatt stood at the gate and watched him go, and underneath the steadiness he'd held for that entire conversation, something was shaking. Not fear exactly, the recognition of how exposed they still were. The cistern was a lifeline, but it wasn't full yet. The drought was real and deepening. And Hale knew more about Wyatt's situation than any outsider should. He turned and found Evelyn standing 20 feet behind him. She'd been there for at least part of it. He could tell by her expression. "How long were you standing there?" he asked. "Long enough," she said. "He's not going to stop." "No. And he has someone talking to him, someone who knows this property." Wyatt felt the anger rise in him clean and cold. "I know. We need to find out who." She said it without drama. Just fact, like finding the weak board in the barn wall. "But not today. Today we finished the cistern." She paused. "You held that well, by the way." He looked at her. "Did I? You didn't give him anything. Not even your anxiety. That mattered." She said it simply, like she was noting something in her notebook. Just an observation. But it landed somewhere warm in his chest, because Evelyn Brooks did not give compliments she didn't mean, and he was beginning to understand that a word of honest approval from her was worth more than a week of flattery from anyone else. The cistern was repaired and sealed by the 3rd week of July. They began diverting water into it not from the creek, which was already dangerously low, but from the secondary well near the bunkhouse, which Evelyn had determined was drawing from a different underground source and running clearer and stronger than it should have been given the surface conditions. She'd figured it out by timing the draw rate and comparing it to rainfall data, and when she explained her reasoning to Wyatt, he'd simply said, "Show me," and she'd shown him, and he'd believed her. The well held. The cistern began to fill. It was slow. It was nowhere near enough for everything they needed. But it was something, and in the middle of a disaster, something is the most important word in the language. The dust storm arrived on a Friday. They had 1 hour of warning. The sky to the west turned the particular color that old Plains hands knew and feared, a yellow-brown that meant the wind was carrying the topsoil of 100 dry miles. Wyatt and Dale and every available hand spent that hour getting cattle into the most protected pens, boarding the weaker outbuildings, and securing the northeast barn over the cistern with every brace and rope available. Then the storm hit. Wyatt had lived through dust storms before. He'd lost fencing to them, lost equipment, lost 2 calves once to sheer panic-driven injury during the worst of it. This one was worse than any he remembered in 11 years. It lasted 5 hours. When it was over, the world was buried under a fine red layer of displaced earth. The air tasted of iron, and the silence that followed felt like the silence after something has been broken. Dale came to find him while he was still assessing the fence line on the east side. The look on Dale's face was the one that meant bad news already counted and found to be as bad as feared. "East section fence is gone," Dale said. 200 yards, maybe more. Wind took the posts. Cattle? Most of them held in the south pens, but the east section group... Dale stopped. Wyatt looked at him. "Dale, 40 head, maybe more. They broke through when the fence went and ran." He paused. "In a dust storm, in the dark." 40 head. At current prices, depressed as they were by drought, and everyone selling at once 40 head represented. Wyatt ran the numbers fast and felt them like a physical impact. Thousands, maybe everything they'd built in the past 2 months. He walked to the east fence line without speaking. The fence was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Posts snapped at the ground wire, tangled and buried under red dust, and beyond it, the open land stretching dark and empty. He stood there for a long time. He heard her come up behind him. He knew her footsteps now, had learned them over 2 months of shared space and shared work. The particular rhythm of her stride. "How many?" she asked. 40, maybe more." Silence. "We'll find them," she said. "In this..." He gestured at the dark. "First light," she said. "They'll bunch together in this wind. Cattle don't scatter as far as people think. When they're frightened, they find each other. We'll organize a search party at dawn. I'll have Dale map the most likely drift paths based on the wind direction tonight." He turned to look at her. She was standing at the edge of the broken fence line with her coat pulled close and her notebook, her always present notebook, held against her chest, and her face in the darkness was calm. Not performed calm. Real calm. The kind that came from looking at a crisis and seeing a problem rather than a catastrophe. "Evelyn," he said. His voice came out rough. "We haven't lost yet," she said. "The fence is down, the cattle ran. We don't know how many we've lost until we've looked." She met his eyes. "Don't call it before the count." He wanted to tell her that standing at a broken fence in the middle of a drought that was eating his ranch alive and losing 40 head in a storm was a reasonable time to start calling it. He wanted to say that he'd given 11 years to this land, and it was possible he'd given everything he had, and it still wasn't going to be enough. He wanted to say he was tired in a way that went deeper than muscle and bone. What he said was nothing, because she spoke first. She said it quietly, without dramatics in the voice she used when she was stating something she'd already settled in her own mind as absolute fact. "I did not come 2,000 miles to quit at a broken fence." The words went through him like a current. He looked at her. The darkness between them, the broken fence, the red-dusted air, and this woman standing in it, like she'd planted herself in the ground and decided that was where she stood. 2,000 miles from Boston. Everything she'd chosen. Everything she'd committed. "No," he said. And something in him that had been pulling toward surrender pulled back. "No, we didn't." She nodded once. "Then go get some rest. We start at first light." He didn't argue. But he didn't go inside immediately. He stood at that broken fence for another minute, long enough to feel the weight of the moment fully, because he knew with the clarity that sometimes comes in the worst moments that this night would be one of the ones he'd remember. Not for the storm, or the fence, or the lost cattle. For her. For the way she'd said it. They found 31 of the 40 cattle at first light. 3 were recovered over the following 2 days by neighboring ranchers who'd found them and sent word. Wyatt returned the favor by sending 2 of his hands to help repair a fence on Pete Garfield's property the following week. 6 were gone, injured or dead in the storm, dark, unrecoverable. 6 was not 40. 6 was survivable. Barely. The finances now were brutally tight. Evelyn sat with the ledger the night after the final count was confirmed and did the arithmetic without flinching, and the arithmetic said they had enough to sustain the operation through October if nothing else went wrong. If the cistern held, if the remaining herd held, if the drought broke before November. 3 large ifs. "Tell me the honest version," Wyatt said, watching her face while she looked at the numbers. "I just did," she said. "Tell me the version where one of those things doesn't hold." She was quiet for a moment. "If the drought runs past October and the cistern doesn't refill adequately, we'll need to make a decision about the herd in September. How many to sell, how many to hold, how much debt we're willing to carry." She looked up. "And if Hale gets to the bank before we do and makes the right conversations, our credit could get complicated." Wyatt felt the familiar weight of it. Then something else, anger, clear and useful. "He won't get to the bank," he said. "I'll ride to the county seat this week and talk to Morrison directly." "That's the right move," she said immediately. "You think he'll hold our credit?" "I think if you walk in there and show him what we've found, the cistern, the plan, the adjusted herd schedule, he'll see a man who has something worth betting on." She paused. "But take me with you." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I can show him the numbers. And numbers presented correctly are more convincing than confidence." A beat. Even very good confidence. He almost smiled. It was the first thing either of them had said in 3 days that was anywhere near light. "All right," he said. "We ride Thursday." She looked back at the ledger, and in the quiet between them, with the lamp burning low and the ranch dark and still outside, and everything they'd built teetering on the edge of what the coming weeks would bring, Wyatt had a thought he couldn't dislodge. He didn't want to be doing this with anyone else. Not just the arithmetic, not just the survival planning, All of it. The whole impossible, terrifying, grinding, sometimes remarkable project of keeping this ranch alive. He wanted to be doing it exactly like this. With her at the other side of the table, and that notebook open, and those dark, honest eyes going over the numbers and saying the hard thing plainly because she respected him enough not to soften it. He wanted this. Her, specifically. He wasn't ready to say it yet. The timing was wrong. The circumstances were wrong. Everything was still on fire in a slow and very expensive way. But he knew it. With the same certainty, he'd known this land was worth fighting for. He just had to make sure they both survived long enough for it to matter. Outside, the night was dry and still. And somewhere to the southwest, a line of clouds was building on the horizon, too far to mean anything, yet too early to trust, but there. Wyatt didn't see them that night. He was looking at his wife. Evelyn turned a page in the ledger. And the fight went on. They rode to the county seat on Thursday, the way Wyatt had said they would. He'd told Evelyn to bring the numbers, and she brought the numbers, all of them organized into a presentation that Morrison at the First Territorial Bank of Red Mesa County had clearly not expected from a rancher's wife. Wyatt watched the banker's face shift across the first 10 minutes of their meeting, moving from polite patience to genuine attention to something close to impressed, and he felt a satisfaction in that shift that was entirely on Evelyn's behalf. Morrison was a cautious man by profession and by temperament, the kind who weighed every word before releasing it. He looked at Evelyn's figures for a long time. The cistern capacity, the adjusted herd schedule, the revised grazing rotation, the cash flow projection through November based on 3 different rainfall scenarios. 3 scenarios, Morrison said, looking up. Best case, likely case, and worst case, Evelyn said. I find it's more useful to plan for all 3 simultaneously than to commit to one projection and be wrong. Morrison looked at Wyatt. Where did you find this woman? Boston, Wyatt said. Boston had better sense than to keep her, Morrison said, and extended his hand across the desk. Your credit holds Callaway. 6 months. We'll reassess in January. Wyatt shook the hand. Under the table, without planning it, he found Evelyn's hand and pressed it once briefly. She didn't pull away. She pressed back. That was all. But it was enough to make the drive home feel different than the drive out. They didn't talk much on the ride back. The land was dry and brown and quiet around them, the kind of quiet that had weight to it, and the horse moved at an easy pace while the sun went down ahead of them. Somewhere around the halfway point, Evelyn said without looking at him, Thank you for taking me. You're the one who closed it, he said. You're the one who walked in like it was already done, she said. That mattered more than the numbers. He thought about that. Partnership, he said. She looked at him then. Something in her face was open in a way it hadn't been in the early weeks. The guard that she carried like a second coat had come down, degree by degree, over 4 months of shared crisis. And what was underneath it was warmer and more vulnerable than he'd expected from a woman who approached everything with such precision. Yes, she said quietly. Partnership. They rode the rest of the way in that good silence that had become one of the things he relied on most. August arrived like a punishment. The heat was the kind that came off the ground as well as the sky that met you from both directions at once, that made the cattle stand motionless in whatever shade existed, and made the men work in half-hour bursts with water breaks between that Evelyn had insisted on over Dale's initial protest. Dale had stopped protesting Evelyn's operational decisions sometime around the middle of July. He'd seen too many of them be right. The creek was now barely more than a seam of moisture between cracked mud banks. Wyatt had stopped looking at it daily because the looking served no purpose except to chip at his morale, and he couldn't afford chipped morale. He looked at the cistern levels instead, which Evelyn checked and recorded every morning with a measuring rod she'd fashioned from a fence post, with notches cut at measured intervals. The cistern was holding. Barely, but holding. What was not holding was the neighboring valley. Word came from Hank Briggs on the second Saturday of August. Not a visit, but a rider, which told Wyatt it was urgent before Hank's message was even delivered. The Garfield ranch had sold. Pete Garfield, who'd ranched that land for 19 years, who'd told Wyatt just last spring that he'd die before he let Hale touch his property, had sold. His water gave out in the first week of August. His cattle started dying. And Victor Hale had been there within 48 hours, with a revised offer lower than the first as promised, and Pete had taken it, because there was nothing else left to take. Wyatt read Hank's note standing in the yard and felt the news like a cold hand on the back of his neck. Dale was beside him. "Garfield sold," Dale said. It wasn't a question. Garfield sold. That means Hale now owns the south approach and the west pasture boundary. Dale paused. He'll have eyes on everything we move. I know. Wyatt. Dale said it differently, carefully. He's going to make it harder now. He controls the road access to the southern grazing land. If he puts up a fence, he can't fence County Road. He can fence his land up to the county road edge and make it so uncomfortable to use that it amounts to the same thing. Dale said it without heat, just experience. I've seen men do it before. Wyatt folded the note and put it in his pocket. He needed to think, and he needed to think without letting the anger run the thinking, because angry decisions on a drought-stricken ranch with a credit line and a family to protect were the kind that didn't recover from. He went to find Evelyn. She was in the northeast barn checking the cistern levels, which she'd already done that morning, but was apparently checking again because the measuring rod was in her hand, and she was looking at the numbers with an expression that told him she was calculating something new. Garfield sold, he said. She looked up. She'd already known it might happen. They'd discussed the probability 2 weeks ago. But knowing a thing might happen and hearing it did happen were different. He saw the difference move through her face. This week. Hale was there before the ink was dry. Then we have a southern exposure problem, she said immediately. Dale already figured that. Dale's right. She set down the measuring rod. But there's something else. She hesitated, which she almost never did. Evelyn paused to think, but she rarely hesitated, and the hesitation itself caught his attention. I've been looking at the cistern draw rate versus refill rate from the well, she said. We're drawing slightly faster than we're refilling. At the current pace, we have approximately 6 weeks of adequate supply. After that, we start making hard choices about the herd. 6 weeks. Wyatt counted forward in his head. 6 weeks was the end of September. The drought has to break before then, he said. Or we have to reduce the draw rate, she said, which means reducing the herd size before we're forced to at prices we choose, rather than prices desperation sets. She met his eyes. I know what that costs, not just the money. I know what it costs you. He understood what she meant. The herd wasn't just inventory to him. She'd been here long enough to know that. The cattle were 11 years of decisions, and weather, and work made physical. Selling them off wasn't like liquidating a bank account. It was like losing ground you'd won in a fight that had been going on your entire adult life. How many? He asked. 60 head, she said. Sold in the next 2 weeks before anyone else starts selling and the market drops further. If we move fast, we capture a price that keeps us whole through November. If we wait and watch the price fall every day, more cattle hit the market, he said. Because every rancher in the valley is going to hit the same wall in the same window. Yes? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, who's the best buyer right now? Not locally. She opened her notebook to a page she'd already prepared. Of course she had. There's a consolidated buyer out of Fort Worth I've been corresponding with for 3 weeks, she said. He's been offering stable prices because he's buying for a Northern Territory contract that doesn't care about drought. He needs consistent supply, not bargain pricing. She looked up. I wrote to him in July. Wyatt stared at her. In July. I wanted the relationship established before we needed it. Relationships made in desperation have worse terms than relationships made in preparation. He didn't have a single word for a full 5 seconds. Then he said, Evelyn. Yes. You have been 5 steps ahead of this entire situation since June. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the thing that lived in the same neighborhood. "Only 4 steps," she said. "The storm set me back 1. And despite everything, the creek, the cistern, the Garfield sale, the 60 head, they were about to let go." Wyatt laughed. A real one. It came up from somewhere genuine and broke something loose in his chest that had been tight for weeks. And across from him, Evelyn's expression broke open into the smile she'd been holding just short of for months, and it was the most remarkable thing he'd seen since she stepped off that train. He wanted to say something. He wasn't ready, but he wanted to. "Contact the Fort Worth buyer," he said. "Tell him we're ready to move." The 60 head sold in 9 days at a price that was, as Evelyn had calculated, significantly better than what the Valley Market would offer 2 weeks later when the selling started in earnest. Word spread fast. Wyatt Calloway was moving cattle, which meant Wyatt Calloway thought the drought had more left in it, which meant other ranchers started calculating their own timelines with more urgency. Hank Briggs called it the most useful piece of valley-wide information Wyatt had ever accidentally released. "You set the signal without meaning to," Hank said. "Evelyn meant to," Wyatt said. Hank looked at him for a long moment. "You know what I see when I look at you two." "I'm sure you'll tell me. I see a man who spent 10 years trying to run a ranch like a one-man operation because he didn't trust anyone else to care about it the way he did," Hank said. "And I see a woman who spent 7 years doing everything right for people who didn't deserve it. And I see what happens when those two people find each other." He paused. "It's something, Wyatt." Wyatt said nothing, but he didn't argue. The source of Hale's inside information revealed itself in the second week of August, and it came from the most unexpected direction possible. It was Dale who found it. Dale, who'd been quietly paying attention to who had access to the property records and the operational details that Hale kept demonstrating he knew, and Dale, who had 8 years of watching this ranch and knew every person who moved through it, came to Wyatt on a Tuesday morning with a name: Tom Greer. One of the newer hands hired the previous spring. Quiet man, competent enough, nothing memorable about him. Except that Dale had watched him over 2 weeks consistently position himself near conversations he had no work reason to be near. And Dale had noticed that Tom Greer's brother-in-law worked in Victor Hale's household. Wyatt's first instinct was cold fury. His second was Evelyn. He told her that evening. She listened without interrupting. She always listened without interrupting. It was one of the things he'd come to rely on absolutely. And when he was done, she sat quietly for a moment. "Don't fire him yet," she said. He looked at her. "If we fire him, Hale knows we've identified the source. He finds another one, and next time we won't know who it is." She met his eyes. "Give Tom Greer information that's almost true, almost accurate, just wrong enough." Wyatt understood immediately. "We feed Hale bad intelligence. We feed him a version of our situation that makes him confident enough to wait," she said. "We make him think the cistern is less stable than it is. We make him think we're closer to selling than we are." She paused. "Let him get comfortable. Comfortable men make slow decisions." Wyatt looked at his wife across the kitchen table in the lamplight and thought not for the first time that whoever had let this woman walk out of Boston had made the most expensive mistake of their lives. "When did you start thinking about this?" he asked. "The day Hale arrived at the gate and read your confidence correctly," she said. "He's smart. Smart enough to use against himself if we're careful." They were careful. Over the next 3 weeks within earshot of Tom Greer, conversations happened, natural, unremarkable conversations between Wyatt and Dale that contained just enough wrong information to be believable and just wrong enough to mislead. The cistern wasn't filling as hoped. The Fort Worth deal had fallen through. Wyatt was reconsidering his position. 2 weeks later, Hale sent a new offer. Lower than the last one. Much lower. The offer of a man who believed he was waiting for an inevitable surrender. Wyatt looked at the offer when it arrived by messenger and felt a satisfaction so clean and complete that it almost surprised him. He didn't reply to the offer. He just let it sit there, unanswered, which was its own kind of answer. Uh, it was on a Sunday evening in late August that the thing between them finally moved into words. Not the practical words, they'd had thousands of those. Not the planning words, or the crisis words, or the quiet by lamplight words that had built something real without either of them naming it. The other kind. The kind that required more courage than facing a drought, or a land baron, or a broken fence in the dark. They were sitting in the main room the way they'd fallen into the habit of doing most evenings. The house was quiet. The ranch was quiet in the way it was quiet now, not the quiet of rest, but the quiet of waiting, of holding its breath through the last hard weeks of summer. Wyatt put down the fence report he'd been reading for 20 minutes without actually reading it, and looked at her. She was writing in her notebook. She'd been writing steadily for 10 minutes, that focused attention she brought to everything that meant something to her. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "What are you writing?" A pause. "Contingency plans," she said. "For October. 3 different scenarios depending on rainfall in September." He should have expected that. Always planning. Someone has to. "I used to do it alone," he said. "The planning, the contingencies." He paused. "I didn't know I was doing it alone. I thought that was just how it worked. One person, one ranch, one set of problems to solve." He looked at her steadily. "I was wrong about that." She set down her pen, slowly, like she was being careful about something. "What were you wrong about specifically?" she asked, and her voice was quieter than usual. "I was wrong that a ranch is just land and cattle and fence line and water." He held her gaze. "It's a life. And a life run alone is just its management, its maintenance. It's not a life." He paused. "You made this a life, Evelyn?" The silence between them was different from every other silence they'd shared. Charged with something that had been building since June and had nowhere left to go but here. "I came here for a partnership," she said carefully. "That's what I told you. That's what I told myself." "I know. But somewhere around the 3rd week..." She stopped. Started again. "When you followed me out with the lantern that first night. You didn't have to do that. You could have let me go alone." She met his eyes. "But you came. And you talked to me. Really talked. Not the way people talk when they're trying to be impressive. The way people talk when they've stopped being careful." He remembered that night. He'd thought about it often since. "I'd never talked about this ranch like that with anyone," he said. "The real version. The parts that scared me." "I know," she said softly. "I could tell. And you trusted me with it." She was quiet for a moment. "Nobody had trusted me with the real version of anything in a very long time." He got up from his chair. She watched him as he crossed the room, and he sat down beside her. Not across the table beside her. And when she didn't move away, when she turned to face him with those dark, honest eyes that had seen through him since the first 30 seconds on the train platform, he said it. "I love you, Evelyn." No performance in it. No build-up. Just the truth plain as the numbers in her ledger, because that was the only language she'd ever respected from him. She looked at him for a long moment. He watched something move through her face. Not surprise, because she was not a woman who surprised easily, but something deeper. Something that had been waiting for permission to exist. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it." He almost laughed again, that same genuine laugh she'd drawn out of him in the barn, the one that came from somewhere real. "Were you waiting for the right moment?" "I was waiting for the drought to break," she said. "I thought the timing was terrible." "The timing is still terrible," he pointed out. "Yes," she said. And she was smiling now fully openly, without stopping just short of it. "But I've learned to work with what I have." He reached over and took her hand. Not the brief press under Morrison's table, not the accidental proximity of shared work. He took her hand and held it, and she turned hers to hold his back. And outside the ranch was dry, and the creek was low, and Victor Hale was sitting somewhere, counting what he assumed were his coming winnings. And inside the house that Wyatt had built himself with 3 years of work, the thing that had been quietly building since a woman stepped off a train with one suitcase and eyes that missed nothing, finally had a name. The rain came on a Thursday. Not a gentle rain. Not a polite suggestion of moisture. The kind of rain that the Texas plains released after long withholding, hard and real and relentless, the kind that hammered the dust flat and made the dry creek beds cough and then run and then rush with water that came down from the highlands where the snowpack had finally let go. Wyatt heard it start in the middle of the night and lay still for exactly 3 seconds. Then he was on his feet. Evelyn was already awake. She was at the window, and when he came to stand beside her, she turned and looked at him, and her face in the dark was lit by something that had nothing to do with lightning. "The creek," she said. They went together. By the time they reached the bank, the seam of dry mud had become a run of water, thin, but moving alive in a way it hadn't been in months. Dale was already there. 3 of the hands. Hank Briggs, who'd apparently been awake and ridden over the moment he heard it, because Hank Briggs was the kind of man who showed up. Nobody said anything for a while. They just stood and listened to the water move. Then Dale, who was not a sentimental man by any measure, made a sound that was not quite a word, and turned away quickly and found something to look at on the far bank. Wyatt put his arm around Evelyn. She leaned into him. Just slightly. Just enough. "We held," he said quietly. "We held," she confirmed. The rain kept falling. The creek kept rising. And somewhere in the county, Victor Hale was looking at a piece of property that had refused to fail a woman he'd never accounted for, and an offer that was going to expire without ever being accepted. The Double C Ranch had made it through the worst summer in a generation. Not unchanged, not without cost, but alive. And alive, as Evelyn Brooks Calloway had understood from the very first morning, was everything. The rain lasted 4 days. Not 4 days of the same hard, relentless fall that had woken them that Thursday night. It shifted and breathed heavy for hours, then pulling back to a steady pour, then heavy again, as if the sky was making up for every dry week of the summer, with deliberate, unhurried thoroughness. By the second day, the creek was running at half its normal summer level. By the third, it had reached the banks. By the fourth morning, when the clouds finally thinned and the sun came back pale and clean and new, the land smelled like something that had been holding its breath for months and finally let it go. Wyatt walked the property on that fourth morning alone early before anyone else was moving. He needed to see it by himself first. 11 years of this land, and he needed to walk it the way you check on something you almost lost carefully privately with gratitude you're not ready to say out loud yet. The grass was still thin. The topsoil was still scarred from the dust storm. 6 cattle were still gone and wouldn't be coming back. The fences still needed work, and the northeast barn still needed a new roof on the east face, and the ledger was still tight enough that November would require careful management. None of that was gone. Recovery wasn't the same as rescue. He understood that. But the creek was running, the cistern was full, and the ranch was alive. He stood at the eastern fence line, the repaired section, new posts and new wire solid. Now, in a way, the old fence hadn't been, and he thought about everything that had happened between June and now. The train platform, the lantern, the notebook, the 40 head in the storm, the broken fence in the dark, and 7 words that had changed the direction of everything. He thought about Evelyn. He was still standing there when he heard her behind him. He knew without turning. He always knew her now. "You're going to catch a cold standing in wet grass without your coat," she said. "You sound like someone's wife," he said. "I am someone's wife." She came to stand beside him. "How does it look?" "Like work," he said. "A lot of it." "Good," she said simply. "I was worried you might get bored." He turned to look at her. In the pale morning light, with the rain-washed air between them and the creek audible from where they stood, she looked like she belonged here in a way that went beyond legal ownership or practical contribution. She looked like the land itself had accepted her. Like Red Mesa Valley had made a decision about Evelyn Brooks Calloway and was done reconsidering. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes, whatever comes next, I want you to know that I know." He paused, finding the right words because she deserved the right words. "I know what you did. Not just the cistern or the numbers or the Fort Worth buyer or hail. All of it. What you gave up to come here and what you built after you arrived. He held her gaze. This ranch didn't survive the summer. You survived it, and you took me with you. She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant she was actually feeling something and not yet ready to move through it quickly. You would have found a way, she said finally. Maybe, he said. But I wouldn't have found this. He meant her. She understood that he meant her. She took his hand. They stood at the fence line in the early light and let the morning be what it was: imperfect, costly, hard-won, and entirely theirs. Tag. The valley's recovery was slow and communal in ways that the drought itself hadn't been. During the worst of the summer, every rancher had been fighting his own private battle, too depleted and too proud to show weakness to his neighbor. But the rain changed something in the social fabric of Red Mesa. People started talking differently, comparing what had worked and what hadn't, asking questions they wouldn't have asked before the drought stripped away the pretense that any one operation was entirely self-sufficient. Evelyn was at the center of this shift without having positioned herself there. It happened the way most things happened with her, through practical action rather than social calculation. When Martha Briggs came to ask about the adjusted grazing rotation, Evelyn explained it in full and sent her home with written notes. When a rancher named Cal Dutton rode over to ask about the cistern repair, Evelyn spent 2 hours walking him through the engineering and connected him with the same mortar supplier she'd used. When 3 ranch wives asked if she would meet with them to talk about winter supply planning, she said yes without hesitation and had Dale clear the big table in the main barn for the meeting. Wyatt watched all of this and thought about what she'd said that first evening, that she'd spent 7 years making someone else's life function, and when it was over, her name wasn't on any of it. He thought about how differently she was here, how the work she did in this valley was going to outlast any single season or crisis, not because she was building a reputation, but because she was genuinely, completely herself when she was solving a problem that mattered. He told her this one evening in October, when the first real cold had come, and they were sitting closer to the fire than they'd needed to sit in months. She listened to him say it. Then she said, "You've changed too, you know." "Have I?" "The man who wrote me a letter in March was managing a ranch," she said. "The man I'm looking at in October is building something. There's a difference." She paused. "You stopped treating the ranch like something to defend and started treating it like something to grow. I noticed it around August, when you called the neighbor ranchers together instead of waiting for them to come to you." He thought about that. She was right. He hadn't even fully noticed the shift in himself until she named it. "You did that," he said. "You did it," she said. "I just showed you the direction." It was in the 3rd week of October that Evelyn told him. She did it in the morning, the way she did most important things, directly, without preamble, with that clear-eyed steadiness that he'd come to understand was not the absence of emotion, but its most honest form. She was at the kitchen table with her coffee, and when he sat down across from her, she looked at him with something in her face that he didn't immediately recognize. Not the problem-solving focus, not the warm quiet of their evenings. Something else, something new. "I need to tell you something," she said. He went still. In his experience, those 5 words before sunrise meant either very good news or the kind that rearranged everything. "All right," he said. "I'm expecting a child," she said. The kitchen was absolutely silent for 3 full seconds. Then something happened in Wyatt's chest that he had no language for, a rush of something so large and so sudden that it bypassed words entirely and came out as movement. He was on his feet and around the table and crouching in front of her chair before he'd made any conscious decision to move, and he took both her hands in his and looked up at her face and said, "Are you all right?" She laughed. It was a surprised laugh. She hadn't expected that to be his first question. "Yes," she said. "I'm perfectly all right. I'm healthy. She stopped because his expression stopped her. "Wyatt." "I'm going to be a father," he said. "Yes," she said softly. He pressed her hands against his chest and held them there, and didn't say anything else for a moment because there was too much to say, and none of it was coming in the right order. He thought about the man who had sat alone in this kitchen 11 years, who had built this house with his hands and filled it with work, because work was the only thing that didn't leave. He thought about the advertisement in the Dallas Morning Gazette that he'd almost not answered. He thought about a train platform and a woman with one suitcase and eyes that saw everything. "I didn't know," he said finally. "When I wrote that letter, I didn't know this was what I was asking for." "Neither did I," she said. Her voice was quieter than usual. "I thought I was asking for a partnership." "You were. I got considerably more than that." She turned her hands in his and held on. "We both did." He stood up and gathered her into his arms, the way he should have done that first night at the broken fence when she'd said 7 words that changed everything, and she let him, which was its own kind of statement from a woman who had spent years being furniture in other people's lives. She was not furniture here. She was not an arrangement or a solution or a practical decision. She was his, and he was hers, and the child they were going to bring into the world would inherit a ranch that had survived its worst year because 2 people had refused to quit.
Mom.
Victor Hale made one final attempt in November. He didn't come himself this time. He sent his lawyer, a smooth man from Dallas named Aldrich, who wore city clothes and carried a leather satchel, and arrived at the Calloway gate with the particular confidence of someone who believed money solved everything if you applied enough of it. Wyatt received him in the yard, did not invite him inside. Aldrich presented the offer in practiced, pleasant language. Hale was prepared to be generous given the difficult year. He understood the ranch had survived the drought, remarkable truly, but surely Mr. Calloway could see the long-term wisdom of consolidating at a strong price rather than facing the uncertainty of next year's conditions, which the forecasters suggested might bring. "Tell Mr. Hale the answer is no," Wyatt said. Aldrich blinked. "Mr. Calloway, if you'd allow me to present the full—" "The answer is no today," Wyatt said. "The answer will be no in January. The answer will be no in 5 years and 10 years and every year after that, for as long as I draw breath on this property." He held the man's gaze without heat, without anger, with the kind of absolute certainty that doesn't need volume to be convincing. "This ranch is not for sale. It was not for sale in June when your client first came calling, and it is not for sale now. Tell him I said thank you for keeping his interest. It kept us sharp." Aldrich looked at him for a moment, picked up his satchel. "I'll convey your message." "You do that," Wyatt said. He watched the man ride out. Dale appeared at his shoulder. "He won't stop," Dale said. "He'll stop," Wyatt said. Men like Hale only pursue what they believe they can eventually get. The moment they stop believing it, they move to the next target. He watched until the rider crested the hill and disappeared. "He's already moved on. He just doesn't know it yet." Dale looked at him sideways. "You've been spending a lot of time around a very strategic woman." "Best decision I ever made," Wyatt said, and went back to work. The blizzard came in March, as Texas blizzards sometimes did, without proper warning, arriving fast and white and total in the way that made experienced plainspeople immediately stop whatever they were doing and get inside. Evelyn was 8 months along by then, and for the 2 weeks before the blizzard, Wyatt had been quietly doing something he hadn't told her about, because she would have told him it was unnecessary, and he would have disagreed, and the argument would have been affectionate but time-consuming. He'd ridden to the county seat and brought back the doctor, not asked him to be on call. Actually brought him out to the ranch to stay in the guest room for the last weeks before the baby was due, on the grounds that Texas weather in late winter was not to be trusted, and he was not going to find himself 40 miles from a doctor when his wife needed one. Evelyn had found out about this arrangement approximately 20 minutes after the doctor arrived because she found out about everything. "You brought him here," she said. "I did," Wyatt said. "Without telling me." "You would have told me it was unnecessary." "It is unnecessary. I'm healthy. The pregnancy is normal. Women have been having babies on the Texas plains for—" "Evelyn." She stopped. "Let me do this," he said, quietly. Let me make sure. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, she pressed her lips together in the way that meant she was setting aside an argument she could win, because winning it wasn't actually the point. Fine, she said. But he's not to hover. He understands hovering is your exclusive domain, Wyatt said. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it. The doctor, a patient man named Hartley, who had practiced medicine in frontier conditions for 20 years and was not easily rattled, said it was the most well-prepared household he'd encountered in 30 years and that he would be very happy to stay for 2 weeks if someone kept cooking the way the biscuits had been cooked that morning. The blizzard hit on a Wednesday night. The snow came hard and fast and piled against the house in drifts that climbed the walls by morning, and at 2:30 in the morning on Thursday, Evelyn put her hand on Wyatt's arm in the dark and said, "Go get Dr. Hartley." He was out of bed before she finished the sentence. What followed were 6 hours that Wyatt would never describe in detail to anyone because they were not his to describe. They belonged to Evelyn. Every breath and decision and act of will in that room belonged to her. And all he could do was be present. Hold her hand when she let him and understand for the first time in his life what genuine courage actually looked like up close. Dr. Hartley was calm and competent and said exactly what needed to be said and nothing that didn't. At 8:17 in the morning, while the blizzard pressed against the walls of the house Wyatt had built with his own hands, his daughter came into the world. She arrived the way her mother did most things directly, without unnecessary ceremony, with full intent. Hartley laid her in Evelyn's arms, and Evelyn looked down at her with an expression that Wyatt had never seen on her face before, and would never be able to fully describe something past language, something that made all of Evelyn's formidable precision and composure simply irrelevant, washed away by something so much larger. "Hello," Evelyn said softly to the baby, like she was introducing herself, like she was beginning a new partnership. Wyatt sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both, and the feeling in his chest was too big to be contained in any word he knew. He tried several in his head and discarded all of them. Finally, Evelyn looked up at him. Her face was exhausted and radiant and entirely real. "Well," she said, "there she is." "There she is," he said. His voice didn't come out steady. He didn't try to make it. "What do you want to name her?" Evelyn asked. He'd been thinking about this for weeks. He'd run through his mother's name, his grandmother's name, names from books he'd half read, names from the Bible his mother had kept. None of them had been right. They'd all sounded like someone else's answer. But standing on the other side of the worst year of his life, on the far side of a drought and a dust storm and a broken fence, and a man who'd tried to take everything with rain in the creek and grass coming back, and the ranch alive, and this woman looking at him holding their daughter while a blizzard raged outside a house he'd built in a valley everyone said was too dry. "Hope," he said. Evelyn looked at him. Then she looked down at the baby. Then back at him. "Hope," she said, like she was measuring it. Like she was running it through that precise and honest mind of hers. Then she nodded slowly, and the smile that came with the nod was the most complete one he'd ever seen from her, nothing held back. Nothing stopped short of. "Hope," she said again. "Yes, that's exactly right." The years after were not without difficulty, because no honest story ends without difficulty. There were hard winters, and dry spells, and market drops, and the perpetual physical demands of a ranch that was always bigger than the hands available to work it. There were arguments, real ones, because two people who were both certain and both principled would always find things to argue about, and Evelyn and Wyatt were no exception. There were days when the weight of it all came down on one or the other and had to be carried together because neither could carry it alone. But the Double C Ranch grew. Steadily, deliberately, the way Evelyn did everything. New pasture rotation systems that other valley ranchers started copying within 2 years. Water management practices that old Amos Shelby called the smartest he'd seen in 50 years. A reputation for cattle quality that reached Fort Worth permanently and eventually went further. Hope grew alongside the ranch. She learned to walk in the main barn and learned to read at the kitchen table and learned to ride before she was 5 and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and her own particular brand of directness that sometimes stopped adults mid-sentence because they weren't expecting it from someone so small. When she was 7, she asked her mother why the ranch was called Double C. "Calloway," Evelyn said. "Two C's because it belongs to both your father and me." "Both of you," Hope said, considering this with that focused seriousness she'd inherited directly from the woman sitting across from her. "Always," Evelyn said. "From the very beginning." Hope accepted this with a nod, the way she accepted most things that made sense to her, and went back to whatever she was drawing. Wyatt, who'd been standing in the doorway, caught Evelyn's eye across the room. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since that first morning at the kitchen table, directly, honestly, without performance. The way she'd looked at him across a creek bank when she said the drought was real. The way she'd looked at him in the dark at a broken fence when she said 7 words that changed everything. The way she'd looked at him when she put Hope in his arms for the first time. He crossed the room and sat beside her at the kitchen table, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and outside, Hope was talking to herself about whatever she was drawing, and the ranch went on doing what it had always done since a woman arrived with 1 suitcase and a notebook and a refusal to quit. It endured. It grew. It carried both their names. People across the Red Mesa Valley told the story of the drought of 1888 for a generation. They talked about Wyatt Calloway's grit, his refusal to sell his instinct for survival. They talked about the cistern and the Fort Worth deal and the way the Double C had outweighted Victor Hale while every other operation around it bent or broke. But those who actually knew who'd been there, who'd seen it up close, told the story differently. They said a man had a good ranch in a hard year and thought he might lose everything. And a woman came 2,000 miles with 1 suitcase, looked at what everyone else saw as a failing operation, and saw instead a problem that hadn't been solved yet. And together, they solved it, and kept solving it. Every year, every season, every difficulty that came after. That was the true version. That was the one worth keeping. Because the Double C Ranch wasn't built by money or luck, or the kind of stubbornness that refuses to see clearly. It was built by 2 people who chose every single day to face whatever came at them together, rather than apart. And that, as anyone who has ever truly loved someone through a hard time will tell you, is the only thing that has ever built anything worth keeping.